Welcome to Relationship Mastery, a podcast for those who want to learn how to master the art of creating happy, healthy, and loving relationships. Please join me, Adey-Jones, and my co-host, Barry Selby, each Tuesday at 1 p.m. Pacific for a lively and informative conversation on everything to do with relationships. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us again. Barry and I have a great show for you today. We covered fathers last week, and we thought, what would make logical sense? Oops, we had mothers. So this week we're going to be sharing. What was that? Sorry, Barry?
Say surprise, surprise.
Exactly. We all got here through a mother for somehow. So today we thought we'd talk about the legacy of our mothers and the impact our mothers have on us, and especially on the way that we are in our relationships, our attachment styles, which we will touch on this week. But first of all, I want to ask Barry, what would he say was the legacy that his mother left in his life?
It's actually interesting because I've been writing about this last couple of days. I'm writing some new content from maybe another book. No promises, but maybe another book coming through.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I talked about was about my upbringing because, as I said last time, about how I've had a fairly, quote, normal, or I should say somewhat safe upbringing in my family, even though it was, as I said, unemotional, really, because my dad wasn't a very emotionally expressive person. My mother, on the other hand, was the emotional core of my family, which isn't surprising. I think most quote normal families, whatever that means, the mother's generally the core for the emotional balance. The father's usually like more tough and reserved or stoic is probably a better word. But my mother, she was more of the, if I hurt my knee, I go to her, not to my dad. She'd bandage it up, she'd like kiss it better type thing. She'd do all that sort of the nurturing stuff. I'm thinking there's something else in there, but let me see if there's anything else. So for me, basically, as a platform, and just for context, my family, there's myself and my brother. There's no other girls in the family. There's no girls in the family. So my mother was the feminine energy in the family. And to be transparent, both my parents passed away. My mother first, and she was the most emotional, challenging one for me to lose than my father was. So I know there's much more of a connection there and more of a bond between me and my mother. And also, just as one of the data points, my brother and I are both left-handed. My brother and my dad are right-handed. I look more like my mother facially than my dad. My brother looks more like my father facially. So there's all these interesting parallels between children and parent. So I was more on my mother's side energetically, it seems like.
Yeah.
So there's a piece to start the conversation. How about you?
Oh gosh, me. Sorry, I'm adjusting something here. Well, as we all know, I was not a traditional childhood growing up. I didn't have a father in the house. So my mother, she demonstrated a lot of well, let me just roll it back a bit, actually.
Yeah.
Growing up, I had an absent father, as I've mentioned before, so he was not in the picture. And I definitely felt the impact of that. I felt that I grew up feeling very sort of unlovable and not wanted and abandoned and all of these things that, I've dealt with in years of therapy and spiritual practices and everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really actually sort of interestingly, at my age, coming up more for me right now, is the impact my mother had on my life. I had an understanding of what I thought her impact was in my life. Here's this, strong, independent woman, never needed a man, did everything on her own, raised 7 children single-handedly, created a business that did very, very well, that we benefited from financially. She sent us all to private school, and so there was a lot that looked like she was this really positive influence on our life, and which is true. But at this right old age of 64, I'm seeing things a little clearer. That some of the sort of masks, what am I calling those things? Those horses wear, that the blinkers. The blinkers are coming off a little bit for me, and I'm able to look more clearly at some of the impact she has on how I show up in relationships, how I feel about myself. Because it was very easy to just put it all on the absent father. Oh, it's because of him that I feel the way I do about myself. But it's been really interesting the last few weeks, especially to really have this sort of awareness bubbling up of, there's some mother energy here too that needs looking at and dismantling from, because I think as a child, for me anyway, only having one parent, I often used to say my mother was mother, father, God, meaning she was everything.
Yeah.
And when you've only got one parent, you learn very early on not to piss that parent off, especially if they're a volatile parent or a parent that's immature in any way and takes things personally and can reject and abandon you, which unfortunately was my mother's style of parenting. Was
Hmm.
if I'm not good enough, then I'm going to withdraw my love and affection from you. And for a very young child that doesn't have a father to sort of run to, it's life threatening, and you learn to just like shut up, hold it in, be a good little girl, and make sure you don't piss mum off. So, but again, as I said, what I love about the work that we've done is it's not black and white. We're not sitting here saying, oh, my mother was this way, so therefore she's this type of a person. I can genuinely look at my mother and, as a mother myself, say, how the hell did you do that? Or why the hell did you do that? On a
Yeah.
number of choices she made. But at the same time, I can have utter love and respect for her for what she did do, but again acknowledge the things that she did that were outrageous and that no mother in their right mind would ever subject their children to.
Oh
So,
yeah.
but it's a wonderful, rich conversation, and I think if we allow ourselves, to have these different experiences without judgment of, this makes her a bad mother, or this makes me disloyal, or anything like that. So this was coming up for me.
What's interesting because we have very different family dynamics, obviously, because just two kids in my family, a lot more than yours, but also both parents, one parent. So the energetic differences are very clear, and I love the contrast between the conversations. Like, for example, I was just thinking for a moment also in my upbringing, because of the fact that there was one child, one parent, we'd often go to each parent to take sides when my brother and I had arguments or we had issues. So we try
Mhm.
and get up. We try to get the parent to gang up on the other brother, on the other, the other sibling. It's kind of like the game we played, even though it wasn't very game-like. Looking back, it was like for us. So that's what we did as kids. We didn't know better,
Mhm.
and I know my default was to go to my mother because, to be honest, I was kind of, I want to say scared. Of, well, yeah, okay, I was scared of my dad.
Mhm.
Not that he'd do anything, but I thought he might
Yeah.
because he was very, because again, very stoic. So I couldn't read his emotions very well.
Mhm.
So, and I was firstborn, so I was the eldest, so I had tended to bang my head with my dad a lot more, I think, than my brother did.
Mhm.
So my mum again was the safer place for me energetically. I felt closer to her. So the dynamic difference is interesting to share for the audience. Just how we don't. It's like it's not uniform. That's what I want to say. The relationship we have with our parents is over a spectrum, and so the differences we both have to share with the audience is such a powerful thing for people to recognize that their own relationship with their parents is what it is.
Mhm.
And yes, the value of hindsight, especially decades later, I definitely look at my family different than I did when I was in there. And part of my gift, in a way, was to move myself out of the country, like you did, quite a long time ago. So I've had a distance from my family as well. And
Mhm.
watching how my parents were together, as much as I go, wow, my parents were together for almost 60 years till my mum passed away. Yet I would never want a relationship like they had because
Mhm.
the enmeshment and the codependency that my mother and my dad had. I know we're talking about that in this episode, but the idea of how that dance they had was the way it was isn't something I want to repeat. And I'm sure, well, I know for sure that your parents, in quotes, relationship was something you don't want to repeat either for very different reasons,
Yeah.
you know? So that's what I love about this conversation. It's not uniform. It's not the same. It's all, and that's why I love the range we're talking about here.
No, exactly. And again, as I really want to emphasize, I know so many people feel that by looking, at their parents, at the impact they had on them, or the influence of how to do relationships and things like that, they feel disloyal if they're not putting their parents on a pedestal. They feel
Yeah.
disloyal if they say, like you just said, as much as it sounds like your mother and father were wonderful parents in many ways, and their relationship suited them very well. Whether you describe it as codependent or enmeshed or whatever, that they were both happy in that. So it's
Right.
not, But the thing is, we can also step back, as you say, and have some distance from it and say, that's not what I want. And to be able to sort of pull away from my parent. I remember, I think I know who it was. Gosh, let me think if I can remember the name. I think it's called Through the Dark Woods, and he's a Jungian psychologist, and his name has escaped me for right now, but it's a beautiful book, and it talks about how for many of us, our first part of our life is led either in in sort of cahoots with our parents, as in we live the life they want, or in rebellion to what our parents want. Either way, we are still in that struggle with our parents. We either haven't the strength to sort of individuate and lead our own lives, or we're leading a life to basically say "f you," excuse me, to our parents because we but we're in that trap either way. But to be
Yeah.
able to step back and look at our parents and see the gifts. Well, they're all gifts. There's nothing is not a gift. That's my philosophy. Even if there's stuff you don't like, it's still a gift. There's still something in it to be gained. But to be able to stand back and just sort of not have that criticism of yourself saying, I can't voice this, I can't say this, I'm being disloyal to my parent if I say this, but to just be able to sort of see them as two people, whether they were together or not, who really did the best they could. And it doesn't, I always say to my clients, just because they did the best they could doesn't mean it was good enough. You
Right.
can still
Yes.
acknowledge the pain as
Hmm.
you're loving them and understanding them and giving them, sort of grace. You can also say, but it hurt, and I
Yeah.
don't want to repeat this pattern. The
That's,
other thing
that's,
sorry, you can say, Barry.
that's the key is the fact that the phrasing similar to what you said is what I use is about, they did the best they could with what they knew how at the time. Because the thing is, we look back at our parents and especially when we're kids, like you're saying, like, mother, father, God thing. It's a sense we do look at our parents as being in some ways God-like because they have that power because they're the big people and we're the small people at that time. So
Exactly.
when we're adults looking back at it, we can definitely see through a different lens and more clearly to recognize that the way they were wasn't. I mean, most of us know our parents didn't do the best job they could have done with us because we know better now, looking in hindsight. Not to blame them, to recognize that what they had to work with at the time wasn't maybe as good as what we have now.
Mhm.
So definitely, there's a sense of, if not acceptance, maybe at least compassion for the difficulties they quote faced at that time,
Mhm.
because we are the products, and as you said, it's always a gift. We're alive. That was the gift they gave us, if nothing else. So it's a
Mhm.
good baseline to start from.
Yeah, it's a great one. Exactly. Exactly. That's lovely. And all the other stuff that came after it too. But also, I
Yeah.
think it's important to, we're talking about mothers and the legacy of mothers. And one of the big things that we're going to go into in depth more next week, but is about our mothers that's where our attachment styles
Oh
originate,
yes. Yeah.
is from our mothers, and the impact that has on our life is huge, and it certainly was on my life. And I don't want to, but as we're going to be talking about that, I also look at my mother's mother, and I look at my mother's mother, and I think, my God, considering the parent that you had, and again, my grandmother did the best she could, and my grandfather, but they were absolutely absent of any sort of emotion or love or caring. I mean, I just did not feel it at all from either one of them. So I don't know what my mother's life was like growing up in that environment and how that impacted her, and especially as I was going to talk about the attachment style, because my mother
Yes.
had very, very. Um, well, I'll say it briefly here because we're going to go through it. But we talk about attachment styles, and there are four different attachment styles. There's the secure attachment styles, which we say about 50% of the population have. So there's 50% of us running around out there that have either an insecure attachment style, or an avoidant attachment style, or a disorganized attachment style.
Hmm.
And I definitely think that my mother had a disorganized attachment style, and we'll describe the definitions of those. And subsequently, because of the way she parented me, I also have that disorganized attachment style. And we can talk more about that next. Where's our timing here? I just want to get some timing, but maybe we can introduce it here right now and just give a little tiny example of what each one means. And
Right.
and then we're going to go into depth in it next week and about how it affects our relationships, and how sometimes, when they say opposites attract, it can be hell, because you can get, you know, well, let me describe them first before I describe that. So first of all,
It's like circling around, circling around. Just dive in and talk about it.
I am going to. The secure attachment style is pretty self-evident. You you went through the normal. Your mother was there for you. You had the normal. She'd disappear for a bit, but then she'd come back very quickly, and you learnt to sort of, you just, as for the ages between birth and 3 years old. I mean, you knew that you finally realized that you were not your mother, that you weren't completely attached. She was a separate being, and as you went through that stage of her sort of disappearing and coming back, but she always came back, and she always, that affection that a mother shows, that love that is in a mother's face as she gazes. They did the study with these children that, it was a very hard study to do, but they had the mothers sort of have a very blank expression on their face, and they gauged how the babies reacted. And so there was this sort of, the child would start to get anxious and then cry if the mother was emotionless. Now, a lot of
Yep.
mothers are emotionless for many reasons. They either maybe have postpartum depression, or they may have an addiction of some sort, or a mental illness. So often, even though a mother can be present, they can not be fully present. And so that can create this anxiety in a child. And that's what can form the anxious attachment style. It's like you're there, but you're not there. And, or sometimes, for whatever reason, again, that parent, it's not a consistent, the child hasn't learned that, oh, my mother disappears for a little bit of time, but then comes back. Or if I cry, she comes back. So we can have that. Obviously, if you get all your needs met as a child, you have that secure attachment style. When you
Mhm.
have that sort of intermittent, I'm there, I'm not there, then you have the anxious attachment style. And then the avoidant is usually when the parent is absolutely either um, not present in the child's life for whatever reason. A lot of orphans have that feeling of complete abandonment, no attachment to a secure caregiver. Um, Sometimes, as in my case with my father, he completely wasn't there, but my mother wasn't there either. She was absolutely not present when I was those formative years for me. She was doing whatever she was doing, but she was not present. And and so what that can create is that avoidant attachment style, which is where you shut down to the point where, well, there's no point. There's no point in attaching to another human being or being vulnerable, because my needs are not going to get met. So I'm better off just being alone and taking care of myself. So that's the avoidant attachment style. Then you can have what I described, which is that disorganized attachment style, which is that I want you, and then you come close, and then you're like, oh, I can't take this closeness, because closeness and intimacy creates fear, because often you got sort of abused by the person that was supposed to love you. So then you pull away from that and you become avoidant, and then you feel the pain of being avoidant and all alone in the world, and you desperately want to attach again, and you come out of your shell, you go to attach, and then it hurts again and you run back. So that's that total ping ponging. And I often, as I say, myself included, I'm obviously a lot better than I was, but on reflection, I can see relationships where, I wanted to attach with an unavailable person because they were safe for me, but when somebody turned around and was available, I ran away. So it's that
Mhm.
ping ponging of wanting it but fearing it. So it can cause whiplash, for want of a better word. But
That was a very succinct. I'm not sure. Do we need to do another episode on this? I don't know. You covered it pretty well, so it's a very
well,
succinct description of the styles. But I want to add a couple of things to color it a bit more too.
yeah,
Um, by the way, if you want to do your own research, you can check online. There are books on Amazon about attachment styles too. But the thing about attachments I learned for me that was very valuable is our emotional homeostasis, is the way I put it. Because the thing is, what you said, I want to elaborate a bit more on this thing about the anxious, and particularly the anxious and avoidant, because secure attachment styles, as you said, they're pretty stable. It's like they had a fairly quote normal upbringing, and they didn't have the fluctuation or the variance of availability. So it became so consistency, which creates secure. But the avoidant and the anxious are more driven by an impact on their emotional homeostasis. And I'm using that term intentionally because what it is finding balance. People who are avoidant, oftentimes, is they have only amount of tolerance for emotional availability they can have before they say that's enough and he's back away, because they're almost like it's almost like you've only got a small cup to fill up with emotional affection, whatever you want to call it. And when the cups fill up, they can't handle any more, they back away. So that becomes an avoidance style. Whereas the anxious one, their cup has a hole in it. So every time you put stuff in, it keeps going out and they keep coming back for more, coming back for more. So if you want to think about it that way, it's kind of the feeling what the it's anxious versus avoidant is almost amount of how much they can actually receive, either one to the full or until or because they never do get full. It's almost like that sort of like scales balancing. They're in interesting ways. Avoidant and attached, sorry, avoidant and anxious have this equal and opposite sort of energetics. It's like if you imagine like a set of scales, you've got weight on one side, weight on the other. So it's a potent piece of the learning about how all your relationships get impacted by how you're raised. And the thing you said earlier about your grandmother, that's the thing also, is we oftentimes we talk about, as we said in this talk, the legacy of our mothers, and we did talk about our fathers. But bear in mind that they were children of their own mothers and fathers too. So before anybody out there listening to our podcast starts getting really like belligerent or upset about one of their parents who didn't raise them right, recognize that that parent was raised by their own parent who may not have had the skills either. And maybe a little bit more compassion for your own parent, recognizing that they were a child of that. And unlike us now, who are listening to this podcast and who are on this podcast, we have more tools now than we had back then.
Yeah.
So hopefully we have a greater level of compassion and understanding for ourselves, and that we can see other people through a different lens than we used to be able to see them through.
Yeah. And also, I just wanted to mention, because we are sort of talking, I do think we're going to do another show on this, because we want to talk about, really go deep into it and talk about how it is, how you knowing each other's attachment style in your relationship is so
Yeah,
integral. It is the most important thing, because you can take things personally that are absolutely not personal at all. It's just, you
so
say,
true.
it's
Yeah,
somebody's comfort level. And when
yeah,
they, so we'll talk about that later. But going back to my mother for a second, and the
sure.
legacy she left for me, um, for sure it was, she was in survival mode. I mean, she didn't have time for insecurity. She had to um, basically feed all her babies was one thing.
Right,
But the other thing that I really want to mention too is it's not just how she was raised by her mother, but the environment within what she was raised. And she was a young girl at the beginning of World War II, and there was as different from America. I mean, World War II came to the UK. I mean, it was like the bombs were dropping in
oh yeah,
in in the UK everywhere, and I think there was that impact. I think had certainly on my mother. I think there was that sort of. I think she was definitely a love addict for sure, and incapable of having close relationships. She preferred to have love affairs. But I also think it was impacted by not only her how she grew up, but the time at the wartime. It was like we could be dead tomorrow. Let's just
right.
grab what we can when we can and live it to the fullest. And I don't know if in America they had quite the same feeling, because it wasn't war was not on their land, on their right in their
Yeah.
ground.
Well, it's interesting because this came up recently in conversation with a friend of mine, where they thought the war began in 1941 because that's when America entered the war. I think it's
Hmm.
41. Whereas in England, we knew right up front because the war started 2 years earlier than that.
Yeah.
So definitely there's different perspectives. And yes, I agree with you, because the thing is, like, my mother was evacuated from London to the south coast because London was being hit by the Blitz, and my father went to war in 1944. Right towards the end, he got placed in Asia.
Hmm.
I remember as a kid, I saw he had a samurai sword he brought back, like one of these like homemade like village ones. It was like not ornate or anything.
Hmm.
Memories pop up, about this sort of stuff. So I know definitely that for English folk whose parents were teenagers young during the war.
Just say British, not
Sorry,
necessarily English.
sorry, yes, I know Welsh. Yeah, sorry, British. That was a faux pas on my part.
Yeah.
The thing was, though, also that I think a lot of times in Britain, even geographically, because again, the Blitz hit London, so London's surrounding area was much more affected by the impact of war, literally, than other parts of the country. Maybe in Scotland or further out to the west coast, wasn't quite as impacted. And the thing is, I know for my parents, my mother was evacuated with her parents to the south coast, as I mentioned, and there was something about that impact on the teenage culture in England during that time that created such an interesting time after the war, which is why I think in England, compared with America, the teen angst and the way that teenagers acted, definitely was that sense of like, you're not sure how long you're going to have. Because that was, even though it wasn't something they were dealing with after the war, they've done with it, in the psyche, in the subconscious, that was still running.
Hmm.
So I know a lot of the kids in that generation were challenged by what happened.
Yeah.
And I think I would say that America was different because it was not so more remote, but America wasn't impacted directly
Well,
because it
exactly.
wasn't.
Yeah,
Sorry
I
after you.
mean, you're not hearing the sirens, you're not hearing the, the air raid shelters. I mean, my mother joined. She fibbed about her age and joined the army at 17. She's supposed to be 18, and
Of
she
course you did.
exactly. And so she was, she was in there. But even Wales at the time, I mean, we had the concentration camps basically for the German soldiers. We had
Yeah,
children that were evacuated from the cities all came to live in Wales in the outer countries to protect the children. So, but there was that urgency of, as I say, my mother's sort of, I think it was just like grab anybody and anything you can, and there were these marriages where people would marry somebody they'd only known for a week or something to because
oh
they
yeah,
were at war and they just wanted a beautiful picture of somebody, this beautiful woman in their pockets that they could think about. So they had something to fight for, to live for, to come back for. So
yeah,
a lot of the women, again, were very willing to and wanting to have that deep romantic connection. So, but we're coming up on our time soon. So, yeah, I don't, as much as I just also want to just, for me, just to acknowledge all the incredible things that my mother did do for me. As I say, she modeled strength, she modeled tenacity, she modeled um, so many things, so many positive things. But again, as I said, it's important to also witness and say, these are things that I don't want to bring on to the next generation. These are things that, thank you, mum, but no thank you. I'm not going to repeat these patterns. You did the best you could, but they're not particularly healthy. And as we have a greater sense of awareness and a level of consciousness, we know that these things can really hurt and upset the psyche of a young child. So we don't do it that way anymore.
that's the good news that we can be the one that breaks the cycle and
Yeah.
ends that paradigm. Yeah, and just to say to underscore that, and I said earlier about, and I'm looking back at my own grandparents as well. Definitely on my mother's side of the family was more um, stability, for want of a better word.
Mm.
My father's side, his mother got divorced, and I think it was divorced, or father, or died younger. Her father. So and also had a very. I'm just comparing grandmothers right now and realizing, okay, this is another talk for another time. But basically, simply put, the mother side of mother's family was much more kind, compassionate, caring than my father's side was. The women in that side.
Yeah.
So I know clearly the two lines that I follow through. So for me, the legacy of my mother and her lineage was a lot more care and compassion, and it seemed to have impacted me more than my brother. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure why, because normally firstborn sons tend to follow their father, their mother, but I'm weird that way. So I guess I followed my mother.
Thank goodness you did. Thank goodness you did. If your lineage is more loving and compassionate and being there, so that's a lovely legacy to continue. So
Yeah,
yeah, so this is a wonderful, wonderful talk again, Barry. And next week we'll talk about those attachment styles that we touched on and
good.
how and a bit more about how they originated and how really out of control they feel for us unless we do the work. And it can take a lot of work to unpack that. But that is for next week. So thank you,
Yes. So,
everyone. Thank you so much for
teaser.
joining us.
Come back and join us next week. A little teaser
Yeah,
of what's coming.
exactly, exactly. And I will see you next week, Barry. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
See you then. We trust you enjoyed this episode and invite you to share this with your friends and loved ones. In fact, please subscribe to our Relationship Mastery podcast. That way you'll get each new episode fresh and shiny as soon as it is released. We'd love to hear from you as well. So go ahead and enter your questions and comments at relationshipmastery.show. Take good care. We will connect with you in our next episode of Relationship Mastery.